Today we'll be painting one of the most bravest hobbits from the Shire, a gardener, an eavesdropper, Samwise Gamgee. For Sam today, we have sprayed an undercoat of army green by Army Painter. The reason being is that the bulk of what he is wearing has many shades of green to them. And we will be doing something a tad different for the video today. We will focus on specific sections at a time and paint them to completion before moving on to the next, as there are a lot of elements to go through today. For starters, his pale shirt was painted with stone golem. This will be the brightest part we shall paint today, and it will stand out over the rest of his clothing. With Sam wearing a lot of green, we shall paint this in a number of ways, and first will be a very pale green of combat fatigues. I believe this is for the waistcoat that he has unbuttoned on the sculpt. Both of these need to have some shade added, and the first of these is soft tone for the shirt and green tone for the waistcoat. As this dries, we shall move on to his trousers. A layer of hardened leather speed paint was applied. From a previous speed paint video, we know that the properties of this paint will allow the liquid to flow over the top surface and into the recesses, creating a colour and a shade at the same time. Don't worry if you don't have access to speed paints at the moment, as I shall add the closest alternative shade paint for you on the screen for you to follow, as I'm nice like that. Whilst this paint is still on our palette, it was used on the shirt to add further shade for the buttons and the central parting. Afterwards, a thin layer of spaceship exterior was applied to brighten up the shirt and pick out those buttons, and thus our first section is done. The waistcoat was then finished with a highlight of necrotic flesh. Hopefully you will see that by breaking down the miniature into smaller sections, you can chip away at a model until it is fully complete. Just another way of painting. To get back some of the green for the trousers and create some highlights, Army Green was painted on the upper areas, including the creases, but leaving the darker browns in the recesses. Whilst the Army Green is on our palette, mixing a small amount of Drake Tooth brightens up our green, and this is used for the next highlights on the trousers. And with Drake Tooth alone, I added small highlights to some sections. Although this is not necessary if you are happy with just one highlight, of course. The belt was quick to do. A dark brown was used here to give this small detail space to be seen between the bright shirt and the green tones of the trousers. And a thin highlight was then added for extra definition. Now for Sam's coat, and our third green variation of the day. Elf green was applied as a thin base coat. Now, coming back to the green spray that we used, I'm a fan of having coloured sprays that are close to the overall look of the miniature, and it allows the paint to be applied easier. For example, if we sprayed black first, then it would take multiple layers of our green paint to get the colour and consistency that we need. If only one layer was added, then it would look darker due to the black underneath. For Sam's lighter satchel, or bag, desert yellow was used. This yellowy colour has been chosen again to stand out over the green and the pale shirt colours. And for the smaller bag, mocha skin was added to differentiate between the two bags. It seems that Sam and Bill are the workhorses of the Fellowship, with the amount that they carry. Both of these were shaded with strong tone wash and allowed to dry. As this wash darkens everything, it can make our yellow look dirty. So a thin layer of our base coat was added back in, but make sure you leave the darker recesses alone. Drake Tooth again was mixed into the paint to create a lighter tone for our highlight. And this was painted onto the edges of the strap and bag. Finally, a couple quick highlights were added onto the smaller darker bag using leather brown, and then followed up by banshee brown. Both of these were shaded with strong tone wash and allowed to dry. This darkened down the colour and gave it a punchy green compared to our two previous greens from earlier stages. Once this colour has fully dried, or use a hairdryer if you don't want to watch paint dry all day, 𝗵𝗲 was the colour of choice for the highlights. This khaki green colour has some yellowish tones to it, and will open up the possibility of our cloak to have more greener highlights later without the two pieces of clothing merging together. Some added texture was painted onto his coat to give a slight tweed look to it, by painting lines vertically and horizontally with some hemp rope paint. It has been slightly watered down to make it more translucent. This is an optional extra part for painting Sam, but I would suggest to give it a go, as it will give you a bit of variety for your miniature. And this technique will come of use if you have even more hobbits of the Shire to paint. Moving on to the skin and hair now. We will do something similar to the previous Fellowship videos, but with a slight twist, just to give you some extra options. Firstly, tan flesh was applied to the face, hands and feet. Don't worry if you go over the hair, but try not to get any on the trousers or the coat that we have already painted. And 𝗏𝗧𝗵𝗲 was our base coat of choice for the hair. Don't forget those hairy feet! And now the twist. We shall use speed paints for the shading process. As we know from the previous speed paint video, it works out pretty well. I will add a link here so that you can take a peek after this video if you haven't watched it already. The paint was thinned down slightly here with water and allowed to run into the recesses. Question of the day for you. Have you got these wonderful paints yet? If so, what have you been using them on? And let us know in the comments, as we are all a sharing community here on this channel. Once dry, the eyes were painted. First with mocha skin for the dark eye socket, and then spaceship exterior for the whites of the eye. They were painted at this point because they are tiny. So if you go wrong and paint on the skin, you can go back and touch this up with some tan flesh. Afterwards, barbarian flesh was layered on. It's best to water down the paint slightly here and build up layers in a few brush strokes. To be honest, it's always wise to add a small amount of water to these acrylic paints. This will help you to paint them onto the miniature with a smoother result. At this point, you may be happy to leave the skin here, especially if you are painting a lot of miniatures for an army. But as Sam is one of our main heroes of our story, I shall add a bit more depth to the skin. So if you are with me, let's continue. A watered down slaughter red was applied to some of the recesses, such as the curves in the feet, between the fingers, and the neck area. I feel that these red tones make the skin a bit more dynamic, which, to be honest, with not much extra work involved. And finally, some areas were highlighted with kobold skin, such as the pronounced areas on the face, as well as the knuckles and the toes on the miniature. Sam's hair in the movies has a light brown to blonde look to it, but still maintaining that darker colour underneath. So to replicate this, we shall use our original base coat of 𝗏𝗧𝗵𝗲 and mix this with basilisk brown. About a 1:1 ratio is required here. And we painted the hair strands, whilst leaving the original colour in the recesses. And then just basilisk brown by itself for an additional highlight to the tips of the hair, and some dots here and there to represent the curly hair of the hobbits. And now we can move on to the main cloak. Cultist robe was used for the base coat, and this will give us our 4th green of the day. And if you like green, then you are going to love painting Legolas in this series. Whilst the cloak was drying, we can jump onto the backpack now and paint all of it, including those sausages. And afterwards, light tone shade paint was applied to create our subtle shading for the backpack. For Sam's cloak, we are going for a slightly darker green here, and using the Absolution Green speed paint will be perfect for this. Again, it will alter the top surface of the colour, but also give us those shadows at the same time. The more that I work with these speed paints, the more uses I find for them, just like this. Whilst the cloak was drying, we focused our attention back onto the backpack, and this was highlighted with Monster Brown. Only one highlight is needed here, as the majority of the detail will be in those hanging sausages. The cloak will now be completed by first adding some watered down commando green. And a few brushstrokes here will slowly start to give the cloak a lighter look. You can keep doing this until you're happy with your desired amount. For me, I kept it quite minimal, so it would feel more like a darker material compared to the coat. And for the highlights, field grey was used. However, instead of a singular line on the edges of the cloak folds, a series of thin lines were painted in a diagonal fashion. This not only allows us to have a highlighted area, but also creates a texture to the material. I used the same method as the Nazgul which are pictured here, and if you would like to see a full video on them, then raise your hand immediately and let me know in the comments. Now onto our final details. There were 2 pouches attached to the bag, and these were done with the same colours as we did for our smaller bag earlier. Field grey that should still be on the palette was used for the blanket that he is carrying. And then our sausages were given a base coat of dirt splatter. Hopefully you can see the value of working on a couple of elements at the same time. And you can continuously paint whilst other parts of the miniature are drying, which should enable you to finish your models that little bit quicker. The blanket was then given a bluer shade with a watered down runic grey speed paint for some added depth, whilst the hanging sausages had a wash of dark tone applied to them. This will create some darker shaded areas and make them stand out from the brown backpack a little bit more. And to finish off the blanket, a layer of 𝗙𝗵𝗃 was added towards the edges, leaving the blue shaded tones in the recesses. And a final highlight of fog grey was used on the very edges and the folds. Now to the sausages. To give them a slightly raw looking appearance, fur brown was layered on. This immediately makes them stand out over the brown of the backpack also. Scar tissue was then applied to the upper parts, and a thin line down was painted to give them a highlight. To make them look extra juicy, a gloss varnish was applied over them. What hobbit would say no to these? The last section are the metals. The sword and the cooking utensils were all base coated with some gun metal. Be careful and be tidy here. We do not want any metallic paint to go on the areas that we have already painted. Afterwards, dark tone was applied over the metals to create our shade and allowed to dry. As Sam is using this pan as a weapon, we will give it a bit more attention and some added interest. Inside the pan, we shall make it look well used. So some oak brown was heavily thinned down with some water and applied as a wash. Before this paint could dry, using a different brush, the majority was allowed to soak into the bristles, leaving some of the gunmetal to be seen in the middle. As the pan is used on an open fire, it gets rather hot indeed, so this metal gets slightly discoloured, and we shall do this with a couple of watered down speed paints. Firstly, magic blue was applied to the bottom of the pan, and then once dry, 𝐒𝐼𝐻 purple was followed afterwards. As the paints are pretty translucent here, the metallic colour could still be visible underneath. And as he is bashing goblins about in the mines of Moria, the pan also gets scratched. So as we highlight the metals with some shining silver, we will add a few lines to represent these scratches. And finally, to break up the areas of clothing and straps, a thin line of black was added into the shaded areas around the miniature. This then makes these details pop out a bit more and is always worth doing if you have the time to do so. And now that Samwise Gamgee is complete, we shall paint his companion from Bree, Bill the Pony. This little fella was sprayed with army painter leather brown before the base coat of dirt splatter was applied by using a soft bristled makeup brush. These brushes are pretty handy when it comes to applying paint on miniatures, as the large surface area allows us to paint quicker and saves more time for drinking cups of tea. And afterwards we can switch to a smaller brush and get into all the nooks and crannies to get full coverage for our base paint. We are next going to create some shading for our bill, and this was done by mixing some hardened leather speed paint with some medium. About a 50-50 mix would be ideal here. This will make our paint quite translucent and it will flow into the recesses nicely. This was then applied to the body and also the hair. You can see that it's starting to create our shaded areas, and as this takes a minute or two to dry, a makeup brush was glided over the top surface to take off some of the excess paint and bring back some of the base colour. You can leave Bill for a moment to dry, or to speed things up, I used a hairdryer. We shall now work on our mid-brown colour, and this will lighten up the body, particularly the muscles on our pony. Fur brown was applied by using a makeup brush again. Only a small amount of paint is needed on the bristles, then after dabbing it on a sponge to get rid of some of the excess, we will simply apply the paint in a circular motion. This will form a thin layer, and you can build this up more and more as you focus on a specific area. It's a quick way of achieving a blended look, without too much effort involved. Are you now seeing how we can save time for those cups of tea I promised? The hair was then given a highlight of the same fur brown colour. A cool tip here, instead of using the very tip of the brush, by changing the angle so that it is flatter to the hair, we can highlight multiple strands in one go. Afterwards, a series of lines were painted along the muscle structure to create those highlights. And this will also give Bill a shaggy looking appearance. The head was also highlighted too at this point, focusing on the nostrils and the ears mainly. Moving on to the mane and tail hair now. Because we have used browns for the body, we want the hair to stand out slightly. And to do this, we're going for more of a yellow look for the highlights. Firstly, basilisk brown was highlighted on, very much like we did before using the side of the brush. We created a slightly lighter look towards the top of the hair by watering down the paint slightly and making it more translucent, and then painted on a thin layer like so. Desert yellow was the colour of choice afterwards, and this was used to add a further highlight, but this time we only focused on the ends of the hair and the areas that we painted with the watered down basilisk brown. For extra definition, I used some moon dust and sparingly applied this to the most prominent highlighted areas, especially near Bill's face. But I would say this is an optional extra if you wish to not go this far. Speaking of optional extras, the body of the horse looks great at the moment, and good enough for the gaming table. So if you are happy with that, then you can leave it here. But wait, you know me. I always like to add a little bit more and give you options. So let's continue on. We are going to give the muscle structure on the pony a little bit more definition. So we are going to darken the shades and bring up the highlights. Firstly, some dark wood speed paint mixed with some medium, again about a 50-50 mix here, was added to the shaded areas. And then immediately afterwards, a makeup brush was used to blend this out. It's a technique that I like to use, and it just gives paints a nice transition from dark to light quickly. The paint was also applied for the straps and the hairline. And once dry, we can go in with an additional highlight of tan flesh. This was applied in the same manner as the fur brown a little while ago, by painting on a series of lines. Now, many may not want to go as far as this for poor Bill, as he wasn't in the films much, and he went back to Bree all by himself after the Fellowship let him go at the entrance of the Mines of Moria. But to me, he is definitely a part of the Fellowship, so he gets my extra attention. So, let's add some colour. Some slightly watered down stone golem was applied to the bottom of the legs. And this will add a bit more interest to our model. The paint was also used for the front of his face to create a marking. The white on the legs was shaded with soft tone, so that the off-white colour wouldn't be so bright. And as this was drying, we switched to a small brush and painted the eye with our stone golem. Afterwards, a dot of matte black was painted for the front area of the eye. And now that the soft tone has dried on the legs, some more stone golem was dotted on this time, This will give a slightly mottled effect as his feet have walked plenty of miles across Middle-earth. The horse hooves were painted with a dark grey colour, again to make these stand out, and afterwards they were darkened down with some dark toned shade paint. Now we have done the most significant part of build today, and I won't go through all the bags, blankets and cooking utensils on offer, as this would more than likely end up being an hour-long video. The majority that you can see has been taken from the colours we used for Sam. But I will create a pinned comment for you for everything that Bill is carrying, so that you can take a closer look for yourself if you would like to replicate any of the details. And if you would like other ways to paint Bill, then check out this video on how to paint horses, and it will give you some more ideas. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep on hobbying.